Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that's got to get down to business to make some puns. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm good too. I'm coming to you live from the Netherlands as your European correspondent tonight. I just happen to be sat in a hotel room in Eindhoven for reasons. So it's a good thing we haven't left the EU yet, because it was a lot easier to get here, despite the fact there was 2.5 hours of delays on the Eurotunnel. Yeah. All right. Otherwise, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you. Just like Christmas has snuck up on me out of nowhere, much like this general election, which I know we've been talking about it for the past few episodes, but boy, does it suddenly feel real, doesn't it?
It's Tuesday night, and that means this episode will go out tomorrow on Wednesday, because I've got nothing else better to do in my hotel room than edit it. And this is going to be our predictions of what might happen in the election. We'll probably be terribly wrong. This will be quite a short episode. It'll be mostly Rob talking, I imagine, with a bit of me. And then, it'll go up on Wednesday and you'll find out how wrong we are by Friday morning. How does that sound?
That sounds great. I love being wrong. So let's crack on. Okay.
So, where do you want to start? I know this is a bit freeform as it's kind of a special sudden episode before the election. So do you want to start with the big sweeping result prediction, or do you want to start off somewhere else and build up to that?
Let's build up to that. I might just start with how campaigning's gone this week, because you can tell a lot about how a campaign has gone by the last week of campaigning. Usually parties will target what they see as key marginal seats, and then they'll see how much they can push their luck. So I think the indications for this are Jeremy Corbyn has gone to Bristol to campaign recently. I think he did yesterday, which I would say is a fairly safe Labour seat. It would bring lots of crowds. He's got a lot of support there, but it's not a marginal. It's somewhere where he can kind of rally the troops for one last push. Boris Johnson, on the other hand, went to Sunderland, which is like a traditionally, that's the Labour heartlands. He's in the Labour Leave constituencies, which shows that he's trying to push his advantage a bit further to see how much of a potential majority he can get. Now, in this case, I do think that Johnson has kind of maybe overstretched. He's had a couple of very bad days campaigning up in Sunderland. He had the photo of the boy who was on the floor at Leeds General Infirmary Hospital, which a journalist tried to show to him. Boris Johnson refused to look at the picture and then promptly put the phone in his pocket, which made him look, I think, extremely out of touch, and not seeming to address the issues. That was an odd one.
It's all right. That was just weird. I was hearing about that on because I've been away, maybe foolishly, maybe correctly, on holiday for about 5 days, ignoring anything to do with the election. I came back and I had a solid slog of about 6 Brexit casts to get through, and that was up there as a very weird soundbite.
Yeah, it's been very odd. It was a very odd way to deal with that, and it's a particularly bad look for Johnson. Also, on the same day, he was accosted by a worker who basically she ripped into Boris Johnson, and it kind of showed that maybe he wasn't in his comfort zone anymore. And there has been a big question about how accountable is Boris Johnson over this campaign. He's the only leader not to do an interview with Andrew Neil, which a lot of people, Jeremy Corbyn did it, and Andrew Neil asked quite a lot of difficult questions, and it's seen as an interview which if you get out there without too much damage done, you can hold your head high. Boris Johnson decided to avoid any damage by not doing it altogether. Andrew Neil, in response, empty-chaired Johnson for about 3 minutes after he interviewed Nigel Farage, basically saying, I would have shown this. So, there's a lot of question about integrity and trust in this election, and I feel on these points Boris Johnson is losing some ground over the past few days. I do think that the Conservative campaign has stalled in momentum somewhat, but I fear it may be too little too late to change the overall result of the general election.
It was interesting to see, talking about that, there was a polls discussion that went up. I can't remember which website it was on, but if you look at the polls, Labour have had an equivalent surge to 2017, but the problem for them is that the Conservatives haven't also slumped. So they're kind of marching in lockstep with people going away from the other parties. And it's become very much a two-horse race, as I think we'd already touched on.
Yeah, certainly. I think, I can't remember if I mentioned this last time, but in 2017, the Conservatives had a leader who had a bad campaign from the start, and it stuttered all the way out while Labour gained momentum. In this one, at least, the Conservatives have been able to have some traction at the start, and certainly the tactics of the Brexit Party and not standing candidates against them and then seemingly to fade into nothingness has only helped the Conservative Party to maybe, bump a bit more than we expected. I think when this campaign started 6 weeks ago, we thought, there's a chance that the Brexit Party could really mess this up for the Conservatives. But that hasn't materialised at all. Instead, we're seeing a message from quite a few celebrities online. I think the one that's been most prominent in the past few days is Hugh Grant, who, if you haven't had a chance to see it, look up his reaction to Boris Johnson's Love Actually style video that he released. So Boris Johnson did that scene in Love Actually where he appears at the door and does the cardboard things and does the cardboard signs and says, Boris Johnson did one of those, and Hugh Grant said it was interesting that Boris Johnson didn't hold up the one sign that said it's important to tell the truth at Christmas. And Hugh Grant has been, I know. And Hugh Grant has been campaigning for both Labour and the Lib Dems in constituencies, saying it's really important to vote tactically here to try and keep the Conservatives out. And I think that's a sign of where the campaign is for the major parties at the moment. The Conservatives feel that they have a chance to win the election. Labour and the Lib Dems feel that there's a chance to maybe cause another hung parliament.
Yeah, and it's interesting, one of the points I've seen raised is that the goalposts are in different positions for each party. So for Boris, he was already in power and technically had a majority, although obviously we've been discussing at length all the various things that were happening in the last few weeks and months of that parliament. But for Boris to be seen as winning, he needs to get a good enough majority to put through his Brexit deal. So obviously that needs to be a majority of people who would vote for his Brexit deal. We know that the Conservatives have said all the potential MPs who are standing for the Conservative Party will vote for that deal. So he needs to have a majority that does not include the DUP, because the DUP probably won't vote for his deal, of at least one, just to push that through. And then he's going to have trouble after that with other things, but at least he'd get his deal through, which would be his win. Whereas for Corbyn, he just needs to ensure that he could maybe form a minority government, which is a much easier task relatively, one would think, given how much is going on. But I mean, I think it's probably going to be too close to call anything, but that's why we're having a crazy prediction episode.
Yeah, certainly. I don't mind jumping into predictions now. You can have a quick look at the poll tracker. I have abandoned the traditional one that's behind a paywall now, but I don't know if you actually have access to our classic one. But I've gone for the BBC General Election poll tracker. I'm going off the full polling data rather than the graph on the BBC website, which I think is an odd representation of the state of the polls at the moment.
We're probably going to come back to the Britain Elects one in the future, just because the BBC doesn't tend to have polls up in an easy-to-spot place as often. But for this, yeah, it's easier for you to go to the BBC and not have to register.
Do you want to go over the polls and then I'll give my opinion on what that means in terms of seats? I think that would be good.
Yeah, okay. So, shall we work our way up from the bottom for suspense? So, in joint last with 0%, that is UKIP, the Tiggers, both of which are unsurprising, I think, and I've also played Cymru. I don't know if that's normal. I would have thought they would always expect to get a percentage of the Welsh vote, which would be more than 1% of the country, but maybe it's just a rounding error here. But I mean, they've had a few seats before in Wales, so I think that's a bit odd. Then we have Green on 3%, Brexit on 4%, SNP on 4%, which is, a significant portion of Scotland, but obviously they don't run in all seats. Lib Dems on 13%, Labour in 32%, which is quite the climb from mid to late October, early November. But as I alluded to earlier, the Conservatives have also been climbing almost in lockstep. And the Conservatives are now on 43%, which, yeah, I mean, they were just above the 32% when Labour were down low in the 20s, but they've both risen up together.
So, yeah, that's quite a striking graph. And, I think Sir John Curtis has said this, and, similar people, much more learned than myself, have pointed out that probably a poll lead of about 10% might give the Conservatives between 80 and 100 seat margin in Parliament, which would be a Blair-sized victory for them. Not 97 size, probably more 2005. So third term Blair. So it's still not an absolute landslide, but in our recent politics where we've had a hung Parliament in 2010 and in 2017 and a narrow victory for the Conservatives back in 2015, it would be quite a sizable gulf and would certainly be enough for Boris Johnson to get his deal done, and would make it Boris Johnson wouldn't have a tricky time getting most of his policies through Parliament with that kind of margin. The interesting part, though, where it might not be all doom and gloom for those on the left, is when you have a look at some of the most recent polls. So there's an ICM poll taken on the 9th of December and a ComRes poll taken on the 8th of December, which puts the ICM one puts the Conservatives on 42 and Labour on 36, and ComRes puts Conservatives at 43 and Labour at 36 as well.
It's worth pointing out, between those two, they were a day apart. ComRes is 3 times the sample size, with 6,000 people.
With that sort of, if the margin closes from about 10 to 6%, that's when you're getting into hung Parliament territory. Simply because the way that the votes fall, where the marginal constituencies are, and the fact that this is quite an odd election in terms of where marginals are being fought. Usually you're only looking at a handful of seats, but Brexit has realigned a lot of places, I would say. So some might be considered formally safe. Labour seats may go Conservative. Meanwhile, Conservatives could have a big challenge in London and other major cities. The Conservatives used to have a lot of very safe boroughs in London and were pushed right to the edge in 2017. If that momentum has continued for Labour, then they will struggle even more. And it might be the case that a few high-profile Conservatives, I know that Dominic Raab is facing a big challenge from the Lib Dems in his constituency, and Ian Duncan-Smith is being pushed very close by the Labour candidate there. So you could have, it would be bizarre to have a night where the Conservatives go away with a huge majority but also lose 2 cabinet ministers. It really shows how you're redrawing the political landscape there.
I think one prediction I feel quite confident making is it's going to be an election of surprises. I think there's going to be a lot of things we're going to look back on, similar to 2017 and other years where we've looked at the polls and been like, well, how did that end up as this? And as you say, there's a lot of swing seats where something has happened before, and I think it'll either be, I don't know. I mean, I suppose you could say that the continued momentum to get those people out would be not surprising. But let's say at least it's interesting when that happens. And if suddenly all that support disappears, that would be also surprising and interesting. So I think in those kind of interesting seats, whatever happens, it is interesting and people will be talking about it and what happened for years to come, probably. Well, at least political wonks will be. So yeah.
Yeah, I think the jokers to come out of the hat and the things to look out for are people voting tactically? Clearly the Brexit Party that's fallen down to 3% in the latest ICM poll shows that the Brexit Party aren't really going to split the Conservative vote seriously anywhere. So can Labour and the Lib Dems put aside their differences and say, look, vote for the Labour candidate here where it's most likely to knock out a Conservative and the Lib Dem here where it's most likely to knock out a Conservative? If they can sort that out, then things start looking up. Also, the potential for a youth vote. It was the factor that many people felt swung the 2017 election. Now, there was a lot of talk on the day, and the data after that hasn't backed it up so much. Maybe not to the extent that everybody thought it was. In fact, actually, probably more people of our age late 20s, early 30s voting Labour that helped keep the Conservatives out last time, as it were. But this time there might be a bigger rise between 18 and 24-year-olds, and if they turn out in their droves, that could be a big factor that nobody's sort of really bargained for. Everybody's looked out for it, but polling companies still tend to say that the votes of 18 to 24-year-olds have much less weight to them than compared to the votes of pensioners, just because of the likely turnout figures that they have.
Yeah. What was the percentage of sign-ups, though? I mean, it was very high among that age range.
Yeah, certainly. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but I know it was breaking records left, right, and centre, and it does appear that at least in recent times, particularly after the Brexit vote and the sort of the shock to the system that caused, that young people seem to be more engaged in politics than ever before. So that's another thing the Conservatives may have to be nervous about.
We've had a lot of close votes in short succession, and if you were 16 or 17 in one of those elections and see it not going your way, I think that's very galling, and you're at that point in your life where you feel you can take on anything. And you're likely to join a political party or a movement. You're likely to, it's been a problem for some time because politics seem boring, whereas here everyone seems to be engaged. So I think that could be decisive in some places, especially marginal seats where there's a high student population. Most people won't have broken up on the 12th, I would imagine. They'll probably have a week left of uni.
Yeah, I think that was one big fear, wasn't it? That was right at the time when universities were breaking up. But I think most of those fears have been put to one side, or at least they hope that everybody's got sorted. There was quite a lot of information out there before saying, hey, you can choose to vote in your home constituency or the constituency where your university is. You just need to choose which one. So, fingers crossed. The youth vote is able to turn out in their droves and make a big impact on this election. So I think the one result we can definitely count out is that Labour aren't going to win a majority here. You can definitely count that out, and I don't think that the Lib Dems will do anywhere near as well as they thought they might do at the start of the campaign. Yeah,
I mean, they've dropped maybe 6-7% since before the general election was announced. Unfortunately, they've just been going down. I know it was talked about. I've heard a few things where they're saying Jo Swinton's kind of struggled a bit in some of the debates because of the questions she's been given. I think actually she's handled them quite well, but it doesn't go down as well with the public because it's funny, people moan a lot about people apologising, and quite a lot of what she's done is apologising for things that happened in the past. I think the problem has always been she's tied to that time in the coalition, which we've discussed before.
Yeah, and the Lib Dems have a very small pool of people to draw from, and I don't think there's a single one that they could have that isn't linked to that time in the coalition. I think you could point to anybody in the Lib Dems and say, oh, they voted this way in the coalition, or, oh, they used to be a Tory, because remember, they used to have lots of people who literally crossed the House from the Conservatives to the Lib Dems, and even some people who have joined from Labour as well. I think they can say, oh, they voted for this or that austerity policy or voted with that for the last Conservative government, because they tend to be the politicians that have been around longer. So they have suffered from that. And again, in an election where I feel that the likely outcomes are either a Conservative majority or a hung parliament, if you want to try and keep a Conservative out in your constituency, then you can't afford a possible wasted vote on a Lib Dem candidate to boost their their vote share nationally, but not turn that into an MP. A lot of people are, when you're forced to tactically vote, you're forced to put those concerns aside and say, okay, I'm going to hold my nose and I'm going to vote for this candidate who I might not 100% agree with, but it's the best chance of keeping out the thing I really, really don't want.
And I think it is interesting that these kind of things where they go and interview a group of people, you never know exactly who's in the room. And I think the one on the latest election cast was a group of Scottish voters. So I imagine their viewpoints will be quite different from, say, a rural English constituency. But there were definitely several people who were like, is anyone considering tactical voting? Several people were like, well, yes, because I would probably have voted this way, but I don't want the Conservative getting in, or I don't want such and such getting in. So, yeah, I think that could be quite a decisive factor, especially, as we say, since the Brexit Party dropped out, essentially. Yeah. I mean, there's so many things we're going to talk about in the episode that's going to come out after the election, and we don't have time for right now. I don't want to distract us any further from getting to the point. So yeah, big picture. If you had to put your money on it right now, which one of those outcomes you've described is most likely?
I'm going to say the way the polls are at the moment, it's hard to see anything but a Conservative majority. However, I hope it won't be as big as 100 seats. I'll put my money on around about 40 seats, just to sort of pluck a number out of the air, but I don't think it'll be massive, but I think it'll probably be enough to get it through. That's the pessimist in me.
That's quite a majority. I mean, I still think. I mean, I've seen the numbers and the crunching and everything. I think I'll be surprised if it's the big majority, but that's because I'm kind of using my memories of 2017, where everyone was saying the same thing. But things were much closer then in the polls. So, yeah,
it's a curse, isn't it? It's a curse. The last election, because I remember before 2017, I had a look at the polls and said, well, these polls are saying it's a Conservative victory by loads. The best Labour can hope for is that these are wrong and they'll bring it and it'll be super close. And the second scenario happened. The best thing happened possible for Labour. And the exit poll was really shocking. I think the thing you've really got to look at that exit poll. Those polls are done differently to all the polling that's done throughout the election. They asked people as they came out of the polling station, which way did you vote? And I think the YouGov poll is, they do it, they weight it by constituency as well. So they don't just take the national picture. They say, this constituency looks like it would vote Conservative. That's one mark on there, and that one looks Labour. So that's been proven to be, I think in the last few elections, it's proved to be incredibly accurate. It predicted that David Cameron would win in 2015 when a lot of people expected a hung parliament. And in 2017, people couldn't quite believe their ears when they said it was a hung parliament for Theresa May, because people were expecting her to win by 100-odd seats. And then the results just kept rolling in through the night, and it became a reality. It'll be, I don't know, are you planning to stay up for the election coverage?
I was going to ask you this as well. So I'm getting back from the continent probably on Thursday. I will definitely be able to vote. I know that much. I refuse to stay out longer because I have to vote because I don't have a postal vote this year because I was not intending to be abroad. I'm going to be hanging out with some colleagues and then coming home. I will probably stay up and see the exit poll. I know they discuss these strategies on various shows that I listen to. I think probably the best strategy is wait up for the exit poll, essentially take that as read and try and get to sleep on whatever that, makes you think about the country, and then wake up in the morning and see if it agrees, because otherwise you're just sitting there waiting for new data to come through, and it's really tough. If I was doing an event, like if I was with you or something, that'd be a bit different. And maybe for less snap elections in the future, we could arrange to do something like that and it'd be quite fun, but we weren't expecting this to be now, and it's not a good time for us to be in the same place. I think I'll wait up for the exit poll and then try and force myself to go to sleep. And if I find myself staying awake, racked with worry, then I'll turn on the TV and watch a few more minutes of it.
Yeah, I'll do the same. It's the exit poll comes at about 10, and then try and go to sleep with that on your conscience. And then usually, as it was with Brexit, as it was with Trump, just wake up in a cold sweat around about 2:30, hoping that the poll was wrong or what was right, and then watch in horror as everything rolls in. I took a very depressed bath at 3:30 in the morning on the night Trump won the election. So,
something like that. Wake up, have some whiskeys, go back to bed.
There you go. Yeah, that's an image all our listeners wanted. Me in the bath at 3:00 in the morning, listening to American radio as everything went in. But anyway, that's my advice for the election. Fingers crossed it'll be a good one. Like you say, like we've said, it might be a night full of surprises. So even the exit poll might throw up some random ones. In 2017, there was a constituency in Scotland which was won by the SNP by 2 votes. So there's places like that where you'll be, they'll go right down to the wire, and you probably won't find out those until the morning. I think the last thing I want to say is, where do we go from here? What happens with the result of each outcome? I think is something that I've tried to think about or consider. I think if the Conservatives win a massive majority, they'll get Brexit done, or whatever Boris Johnson's phrase is. They will put through his deal before Christmas, and all go to Christmas and say, "Tally ho, well done, chaps! We've done it. We've broken the deadlock." Then there might be a lot of soul searching for the next 5 years as reality starts to bite. I don't know how. I think Boris has kind of thrived off the chaos of Brexit and the election, and there might be a lot of people voting for him just because they think it provides an end to the situation. Get Brexit done is a slogan that says, I just want this off the table and I want to focus on something else. With that gone, then people are kind of forced to look at the National Health Service and the state of things and what's happened to austerity over the past 9 years, which is, a tougher question for the Conservatives to ask. So that's one thing to consider. So if that was the eventual result, then it might not be a calming down of politics in particular, and Boris might find he has quite a tough time in the Houses of Commons if he's unable to get a handle on those things. If a hung parliament happens, then I think we can see a lot of haggling, coalitions between, Labour, the Lib Dems, and the SNP. There'll be the power three that will have to get something through. It'll mean a tumultuous time in British politics. And I think, it'll mean that, unfortunately, I think I've loved Labour's policies this election. That's, me putting my personal stamp on it. But if they're in a hung parliament, they won't be able to enforce all those policies because they'll have coalition partners who will try and water them down slightly in some way. So Labour will hope to be the ones to bring in Labour's best case scenario is there is a hung parliament, they do the second referendum and a second Brexit deal, and that's the other way that Brexit goes away. If there's another referendum and people vote to remain in the EU, then you might see another general election called and Labour hope to get a majority there. I don't know. There's lots of ways that, everything can go. I didn't see us coming down this path in 2017. But yeah.
No, I think trying to speculate beyond the election itself is tricky. I think that the purpose of this episode is, what do we think is going to happen in an election? You're saying about 40 seats majority. I'm going to give a slightly more positive hope and go for it is another, maybe it's a slight majority. Obviously I know I want it to be, which is not a majority for the Conservatives, but let's assume it's going to be a slight Conservative majority, less than 40. I feel like I'm basing that on 2017, but the polls aren't the same. So we'll have to see what happens over the next few days. Thank you for joining me, Rob. Thanks for giving your quick opinions on that. I've got to shoot off. I've got a booking in the hotel restaurant now.
Cool.
So,
okay,
yeah.
sorry. Yeah,
no, it's fine. I've got to shoot off. It's fine. And we'll finish there. And yes. So until Friday, it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye. Bye.